So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Osteoarthritis Action Alliance Lunch and Learn webinar for January 16th, 2019. Thank you for joining our presentation this month. Our presenter today is Dr. Matthew Lee Smith. Dr. Smith is the co-director of the Texas A&M Center for Population Health and a faculty member at both Texas A&M and the University of Georgia. His evaluation initiatives have been integral to fostering understanding about the reach, adoption, implementation, effectiveness, and maintenance of different evidence-based programs. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Smith.
Wonderful. Is my volume okay?
Yes, I believe so. And if you need him to be louder, please just write it in the chat box and we'll make adjustments as needed.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so very much. I'm very honored to be here and be speaking with the Osteoarthritis Action Alliance about chronic disease self-management in the workplace. So this is a project that we initiated about 5 years ago, and it is now a national and international program that is available. So what I'm hoping to do on this webinar is highlight just a little bit about the issue and the magnitude of chronic disease in the workplace, but really start to talk about the translation process and how it is that we came about developing this program as it looks today, share a little bit about its effectiveness, and of course go on through and talk a little bit about future directions, but also a little bit more about what it means to be able to bring this to your community, to your organization, and what you can do to make it effective and successful in your area. Now, this is a lot of information to get through in 20 or so minutes, but I definitely am going to do my best to hurry through so that we can have enough time for some question answer at the conclusion. So, a little bit about chronic conditions in the workplace. Naturally, as we all know, our society is aging and so is the workforce. People are staying in the workforce longer and longer than ever before, and therefore the number of chronic conditions that are existing among our employed populations is growing and growing. And we really have this desire, of course, to maintain a strong workflow. We need to be productive. You know, these are businesses. So an unhealthy employee is oftentimes a non-productive employee. So there has been growing attention to the need to really have health promotion and disease prevention programming in workplace settings. The issue is that, of course, some of these are very expensive, and some of these also are really needing higher skilled individuals, lower touch points, lower intensity, but yet very costly for employers, and therefore oftentimes not being effective, and also a lot of times not really being something that's attractive for an employer to bring in based on the return they will see. So we certainly have had an initiative that we've been able to digest how it is that we can alleviate those burdens in something that is lower cost, easily implementable. So when we talk about the cost of disease, we again know that so many of our adults in the United States have a chronic condition, with a large proportion having 2 or more conditions. And this number goes up as we talk about older adults. The proportion is not 25% of people with comorbidities. It actually jumps up to about 70%. And with that said, just looking at diabetes, not looking at all of these other costs, we know that there are huge costs, not only for direct care and hospitalizations, emergency room visits, and medical care, but also in terms of productivity. Oftentimes we think about absenteeism, meaning not showing up for work and what that does to a workplace, but often we now think about presenteeism. Presenteeism being that when you're at work, you're actually being productive, you're being present, you are actually attending to your work. People with unmanaged chronic conditions oftentimes can be sitting in front of their computer trying to perform their task, but aren't necessarily doing so effectively or efficiently. And therefore, it really can become a big issue, and in some industries, a safety issue. And with that said, we oftentimes see that people living with chronic conditions also have issues meeting their work demands, their roles and responsibilities, whether those be physical, whether they be psychosocial. But ultimately, chronic disease is one of the leading causes for premature retirement or job loss. We see that this is causing oftentimes a lot of different issues. So we really are needing to address this. Now, I think everyone on this webinar should know about all of the different chronic conditions that are out there and affecting our employed populations. I've highlighted just a few, of course, based on the audience here, because we know that osteoarthritis is definitely influenced by obesity and weight, but we also know there's a lot of chronic pain associated, but we also know that so many of our employed individuals don't have one condition, they have multiple conditions. So a little bit about the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program. This program, and I'm not going to go over it in too much detail, but this is the basis of the workplace translation. Created by Stanford University years ago, Dr. Kate Lorig developed this intervention, and it, since that time, is now one of the most widely available, most widely researched and evaluated and implemented chronic disease programs in the country and even across the world. As you can see, it has certainly gotten a lot of traction in terms of multiple countries, many different languages. But the reason for this, of course, is that it has been adopted and supported through a lot of federal initiatives. The Administration for Community Living has deemed this as a highest tier evidence-based program based on its effectiveness, as has the CDC and others. And really that comes from one of our national studies years ago, not just the randomized trial, where we really saw a return of the chronic disease self-management program for participants over a year-long period in terms of the triple aims of healthcare reform: better health, better care, and lower cost. Now, a little bit about the program itself. It is actually a 6-week program that is implemented once a week for 6 consecutive weeks. Each of the workshop sessions are about 2.5 hours in length. While there are many different issues that are talked about that are universal to many different chronic conditions, it is not necessarily a content-driven intervention. It is more of a process-driven intervention. And really what the program hopes to do is have everybody become a self-manager and to really stuff their toolbox with all of these different tools so that they can better self-manage. I've highlighted here, of course, the problem solving, the action planning, and the goal setting, which are really the hallmark activities of the workshop so that people can start to learn and become more efficacious in their ability to understand their needs and meet their needs. Now, when we think about this program, I've already indicated that it's widely used across the US and it's widely used across the world even, but just so that you can see, there have already been, just as of 2016, over 300,000 participants who've rolled out in this program and who have participated, and of those, many are across the United States. Over half of the US counties have been able to host one or more of these workshops over time, and even reaching into rural counties. And so this is really important when we start thinking about how to disseminate. But through this national evaluation and my ability to work with the National Council on Aging, we started determining that, you know, there were a large number of humans reached by these workshops. However, only 0.7% attended a workshop in a workplace setting. And from what we knew about obesity and disease occurring with younger adults and individuals of all ages, we know that individuals in workplaces and employers are definitely interested in learning more about chronic conditions. We certainly saw a need for taking this program that is primarily served through the Aging Services Network and translating it for use in a younger cardiovascular risk population of employed individuals. And so with that said, younger employees with chronic conditions were really a missing target for this. And the problem is that because the intervention was 2.5 hours in length, it really wasn't necessarily appropriate for embedding into workflow. Employers weren't able to give 2.5 hours at a time for workers to go ahead and take this intervention. So it wasn't that people weren't trying, it's just that it naturally wasn't uptaking. So we naturally changed the structure and the format to be more conducive to these employees and employer groups. And so we did a lot of tailoring so that we could meet these needs. So allow me to introduce what we're calling WCDSMP. So this is Chronic Disease Self-Management Program in the workplace. We have called it Live Healthy, Work Healthy, because oftentimes the workplace chronic disease self-management program is a mouthful, and it's not necessarily a sexy title that really attracts participants. So Live Healthy, Work Healthy is the way that we're calling it. You can see that there's a logo devised. Allison indicated that she would be posting and sharing some of the resources. I've actually put 2 versions of this logo available to everybody so that you can also use it in your marketing if you'd like to use it. But this comes from a 5-year project granted from the NIH, National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, to the University of Georgia. Mark Wilson and I were able to go ahead and create a randomized trial and implement this in rural South Georgia. And really the overall aims of this initiative were to determine how a translated intervention can benefit the work and work performance and health of employees. We did look at some of the biomarkers, meaning the, hemoglobin A1C, glucose, lipids, a lot of these other types of indicators, but we also were interested in this cost effectiveness and the return on investment by having healthier, happier employees. So with that said, our translation process, and there's so much more to be learned about this, and some of these materials are shared, but we really focused on multiple different groups. Not only did we go to Kate Lorig and the other program developers and those who have been doing this for years and years and years, but we also went to the already trained master trainers of CDSMP to talk about what they thought for appropriateness of this workshop as it existed for younger individuals, and got their recommendations of how we can change the intervention so that it would be more palatable. We also did focus groups with different employed individuals with chronic conditions, and they were able to tell us not so much about their chronic conditions, but more about how their conditions influence their work performance and the kinds of needs they really had in terms of work-life balance. And then, of course, the evaluators and translation specialists took this information and created the Chronic Disease Self-Management Program for the workplace. This table very succinctly shows what the original CDSMP program looks like and what the translation looks like. And the bold text here tells a little bit more about what it is that we did in our translation. Naturally, we've tried to maintain the intervention for the same duration of time, but we've taken it from a 2.5-hour workshop once a week to a 60-minute workshop that meets twice a week for 6 weeks. So instead of 6 sessions, there are now 12 sessions. These can be offered on work time or off work time, on work site or off work site. But a lot of the training is still the same. You have to still be trained as a CDSMP lay leader, but you can bridge train then for this as you would for the diabetes, the arthritis, the chronic pain, any of those bridge trainings that you would do for the chronic disease self-management education suites, you would do for this as well. We really lowered the target age. Instead of being 50 years and older, we brought it down to 40 years and older. And then, of course, because it's a shorter time period, we really wanted to make sure that we had younger individuals get into the workshop and fewer individuals so that they could share more and interact more instead of it having big discussions. With that said, we've also reorganized the order and really focused on stress, work-life balance, communication with employers and coworkers about their needs. We've streamlined information, we've omitted information, but a lot of this is available to you elsewise. With that said, we've engaged a lot of different types of workplaces. We've had medical centers, we've had government entities in city and county, we've had school systems, not just the central office or the bus drivers or food services, but also the teachers and the administration, meat processing plants, banks, technical colleges. We've had many, many more that have even got on board since, but these are the ones that were included in the original randomized trial. With that said, when we look at the individuals, you can see that from the national average, we're reaching folks about 15 years earlier than the program as delivered through the Aging Services Network naturally. And so with that said, this is great, exactly what our target was. We do see a large abundance of females, but we also see great diversity in terms of not just reaching individuals who are non-Hispanic white. You see a large number of comorbidities. On average, there were 3.6 chronic conditions, but that includes obesity. And then, of course, we see the attendance rate. And that attendance rate is really looking at 52% of people completing those 12 workshops, but at the same time, understanding that 1/3 of those individuals attended most of the workshops. Now, that's a low retention rate, and we can all acknowledge that, but I'll talk a little bit in a minute about how it's so important to realize that work gets in the way of workplace interventions. And when someone's pager goes off in a hospital setting, they're going to stand up and leave. So we really need to work with those employer groups to understand their workers, their employers, the different roles and responsibilities, so that we can best introduce and embed this into their workflow so that it makes sense for the participants. Now, as you see here with the self-reported chronic conditions, I've just highlighted a few. You see that obesity, we had almost 80% of our participants being overweight or obese, self-reported, and many more, about 20 or so percent with arthritis, and of course, even another 25 to 30% with some other type of musculoskeletal injury or disorder. So you can see that this is very relevant. When we talk about effectiveness, among those individuals at 6 months with one or more chronic conditions, we saw great improvements. Reduced days of unhealthy physical health, reduced fatigue. We saw reductions in sedentary behavior and consuming unhealthy foods like sugar beverages and fast food. This is great, of course, because we had so many of the individuals self-reporting as obese. We naturally saw this as a very positive reduction, but also indicative of who the employees were when they actually got into the workshop and what they wanted to focus on during the intervention. We also saw that there were reductions in their perceived limitations of the work demands in terms of their mental health. So when we focus a little on stress management and work-life balance, we're seeing that this is maybe helping a little bit in terms of their mental demands on the workplace. Also, increases in communication. And that's a really important one. And that's one thing that we really focused on in this translation, was not just the communication between patients and providers, but really expanding to communication with coworkers and supervisors and family members, not just those providers. So when we think about this in the translation, I hope you see that, going through this very, very quickly, we were able to reach a great number of diverse individuals in diverse workplaces. But we also note that when compared to the way this intervention is actually delivered nationally and who it's reaching, that younger adults really are unique to who is typically served with this intervention. Oftentimes older adults, while they're still in the workforce and still having, family life and work and balance and stress, oftentimes a younger employed individual with chronic conditions is not only managing their chronic condition, they're also managing, family life, and they might be caregiving for a spouse or an older adult parent or even a child. So they have a lot of these different balances in addition to their work responsibilities. So we're really seeing that there are some very different breakdowns that occur when an individual is older, where more physical breakdowns or more symptomology may be observed, where with younger individuals, it's oftentimes more mental and stress related. So we really saw this, and it's something to think about when you think through how it is that you can engage a younger employed population. We also know, as I mentioned earlier, that work interferes with workplace health programs. Oftentimes, the week-to-week schedules are not the same for all employees. A lot of times with shift working, there's not necessarily the same time of day that the employee shows up. So depending on the workplace that you go to and where you want to offer this intervention, you really need to better understand who they are and how it is that they actually get into these different types of interventions. How can they offer them? How is it that we can offer it either before work, during work, immediately after work? Do we vary the time that it's offered so that it's not the exact same time and day each and every single week? It kind of rotates based on the employee availability. We also start thinking about maybe we host 2 workshops simultaneously at 2 different time points so that people can drop in, drop out as they need. and still be able to get the full intervention value. But what we can tell you is that offering these on work time, on work site is the best way to get attendance, because employees are less likely to travel elsewhere off of work time to go to an intervention. They're typically going to come to work, and therefore if they're at work and they can offer or attend on work time, they're more likely to show up. We also know that you need to work with the organizations. We have a different ask. I work with a lot of different individuals across the country when they're trying to work with this program to say, how is it that we can best see if this is embeddable into a workplace, into a workflow? How do we get leadership support? How is it that we not only get the CEO or the lead to agree to allow us to work with their employees, but how do we actually work with each individual department to make sure this meets their needs and is embeddable in their workflow? For example, even though a principal at a school might say, sure, come to our employees, we give you all of the access to come and give this intervention. Well, that's great. Maybe the superintendent says that. Well, if the superintendent gives approval, we still may want to go ahead and talk to each principal independently, but then in each school independently, we still might want to talk about each of the divisions, the teachers versus custodial versus food services versus bus drivers, because each of them are on different schedules. It's not a one size fits all. So there's a lot of need to really think through how this can be embedded. And incentives are wildly important. And those are very different, not necessarily financial incentives, but each workplace has their own way of giving incentives. Offering this on work time is one great incentive, that they can do things for better health while on the clock. But for example, in schools, they love jean days. So put on a pair of jeans on a Friday. We'll let you do that if you participate. We've had all kinds of incentives, and I can share much, much more. Now, I want to conclude by just saying that the Self-Management Resource Center, SMRC, handles all the licensing and cross-training. I'm providing their information. And when moving forward, we really are doing so much more. We're starting to analyze the 12-month data, some of the cost data, starting to do more nuanced analyses. But really what I see as the opportunities with this intervention is, and I spoke with Kate yesterday, she said that there have been over 100 organizations who've engaged this program nationally already. There's also efforts internationally that master trainers have already been trained. Even in Japan, I've been told they're going to take it and translate it so that they can start using it over in Japan. So this program is starting to grow legs, and we're very excited about it, but we really need to learn more about its effectiveness and the ability to embed it efficiently. We need to diversify the types of groups that we get into the intervention so that we can learn more about who it works better for or who it works well with, or whether universal benefits are seen. But then we also are developing more materials. Remember, the ask is not like going to a faith-based organization to say, hey, can we have access to your congregates? It's not going to a healthcare or hospital system to say, hey, can we offer this to your cancer patients, your diabetes patients? The ask is different. We're now asking them to do it for their own employee group. And everybody's concentrating on being productive and making their meeting their objectives and not detracting from what their goals are as a business. So the ask is different, the value added is different, the pitch is different than what we're typically doing with chronic disease self-management programs. And that's really fun for us because this is new territory and an opportunity to reach a new segment of the population who is benefiting from an intervention like this. As I said, translations are happening in terms of language, but also we're going to start integrating technology. Now, I'm going to stop there, and I don't know how much time I went on or went off, but I do believe we still should have about 6 or so minutes for question and answer.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Yeah, we have quite a few minutes left for question and answer, so please feel free to type in any questions you have into the chat box and to the bottom. And I did get a question actually in advance that I'll go ahead and start with from one of our participants. Were employees or employers ever concerned about privacy? I was wondering if this was a deterrent for some potential participants in a workplace setting.
That is a wonderful question, and one that we considered from the beginning, and one that we've been attempting to disentangle the entire time with our data. First and foremost, as I said in the translation process, we engaged a lot of employers, but also employees living with chronic conditions, and we asked them those similar questions. And I think the point is, the intervention as we've designed it does not focus on the chronic condition itself. Individuals don't have to divulge the chronic condition they have, rather talk about the ways that that chronic condition is symptomatic, how it influences their life or their work. So people are much more apt to talk about those types of things, but also I would say it depends on the workplace. Some organizations, they go to happy hours together, they're friends at work, and therefore maybe they're more apt to share. Whereas other organizations, maybe the climate isn't as, welcoming to that kind of open forum. We start having those conversations early when deciding whether or not to introduce this workshop, just because we want to make sure that the work environment is conducive to an open interactive format, and therefore also ensuring that any data that will be collected or anything that is said in the room stays in the room, everything remains confidential. We've also had issues that we've talked about or instances where the employer or the supervisor or even the hospital CEO joined in the workshops, and they were in the workshops with their employees, and that didn't seem to cause a problem at all. The nature of the program is that it's very encouraging, it's very uplifting, and it's not a doom and gloom program. So we've really seen limited concerns about that, but that's also because the nature of the program is that employees or participants can share as much or as little as they want.
Yeah, that's a great point you make there about it's really not focused on a specific disease. It's really just about improving your overall health and different conditions that you have.
I agree. Can I also say one more thing here? And that is, this is a very brief webinar, but I did want to say that on February 12th, that is a Tuesday at 2 p.m. Central Time, the National Council on Aging is going to be hosting another webinar, again, February 12th on a Tuesday, about this workplace CDS&P. It's going to be actually an hour and a half long, where Kate Lorig will be on, Sean Knipe will be on from UNC Chapel Hill about her experiences working with low-income employed groups. Heather Zurcher will be on, and we're going to explore this topic much, much more in depth than what I've done here. So just a little teaser that in about a month, there'll be another opportunity.
And I realize we have reached the 12:30 point, but we have quite a few questions left that we'll try to get through. So we understand if some of you all need to sign off now, but if you're able to stay on, we will continue the discussion. All right, so our next question we have is from Marielle Peter. She says, hello, have you written a value proposition template to use with marketing with employers?
Hi, Mary. So we have not yet, and we are still working through that data. And so what we're now starting to see, and because we're continuing this intervention on and we're engaging more and more folks, we're starting to see how that growing number of participants can relate into cost. Unfortunately, with the initial trial, because of the small size in each type of work group, or in each kind of employer group, we can go ahead and start to see a collective impact and start to hypothesize about that. But I do believe the value proposition will differ based on the employee type and also the employer setting and type. So with that said, the short answer is no, but the great news is that it's forthcoming.
Great. Good to know. Good to hear. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. So have you found employers willing to pay for the workshop as they pay for other services? How do you pitch it? Value propositions? Who pays for the trainings and the licensing? All that kind of fun budget stuff, I guess.
Absolutely. And this is something that, again, I work with, and these supplemental materials are going to start really being able to support grand scale dissemination and embedment. So when we think about this, first and foremost, yes, Employer groups have been paying for the workshops. One of the things that you need to think about is, are you going to train one of their employees to offer the workshop, or can they contract with, a AAA, an area agency on aging, so that they come in and offer the workshop like traditionally is done? With that said, we can put a dollar amount on what we believe the per participant cost is. And based on the national cost savings, we can actually start to project that there should be similar cost savings, even though we don't have specific value propositions for this translation of the intervention. So with that said, there are ways, and I believe one of the documents I shared was a flyer that we've been using that basically is a one-pager. It says, hey, there's a problem, and we all know there's chronic conditions. Here's this intervention. Here's what it looks like. It is shown to be successful, and we can embed it into your organization with limited cost, limited time. The question becomes, how do you want to do it? And so with that said, I think that the entire issue becomes working with an organization. They're not all quote unquote created equal. And so some smaller organizations aren't going to be able to pay an extraordinary amount to be able to bring this in. But when you think about the amount of data collection that's needed, which is quite minimal, but then again, they might want to know more about their employees. They might want a report at the end so that they can better understand what happened, because they want to see a value return. So based on those nuances, the pricing can differ. And I can follow up with everybody after the fact and talk more about this. But what I will tell you is we have been in talks with at least 5 different organizations, from very small to very large, about taking this program and embedding it for their employees. And as we learn more, and as our value propositions are really being made and everyone is seeing the value, we'll make sure to make that available to the entire network. But the reality is, yes, employers are excited about it. They see the value, even without specific numbers. And so I think the key is to learn a little more about the business acumen and the ask. We're not going to just the older adult population and asking for entrance. We're asking an employer who has to concentrate on their role, their bottom line, to let us interfere with their workflow a little bit. And so that's why the ask is different, but the values are all the same that we see from the original program.
Yeah, that ask is very important and very tricky. It seems to get exactly right. And then a kind of follow-up question on that. Do you have any experience with EAP programs getting involved? Employee assistance programs, I guess?
No, but I think that would be very interesting to explore.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how those could kind of work together, and it's kind of a package deal.
Oh, absolutely. And what we've been seeing is, again, I don't know exactly about the employee assistance programs, but we do know that by working with larger, sole source employers, or even healthcare payers, that integrating this in as even not the say-all solution, but just one of a menu of different touch points available to their employees is very doable. So I would love to work more with them and see what they're offering and how this could complement.
Yeah, that's a great point. And one last question I'll try to squeeze in here. No others come up. Are there any efforts for the CDC to approve this workplace program as an AAEBI?
So there is, I have talked with the CDC about this, not specifically for that approval. One of the things that is still needed is a little additional data. The requirements, even though they acknowledge and they have written this in as an acceptable supporting program for some of their calls for funding, whether or not it's officially on their list or not is still to be determined in what capacity. So that is still ongoing, but that is certainly something that is a 2019 goal.
Thanks. All right. Well, I know we're a few minutes over. We can see if there's any other questions. But with that, we might have to end the conversation. I think if you want to, again, pitch that webinar coming up next month that will go more in depth with this, I think clearly there's a need for this and people are very excited about this opportunity and the program and the research that's gone on with this. So if you want to share that information again, Matthew, that'd be great.
Yes, this is a webinar hosted by the National Council on Aging, NCOA, and it will be about the workplace CDS&P. It takes place on Tuesday, February 12th at 2 p.m. Central Time. And it will be a duration of an hour and a half in length, but a lot of that will be substantial question answer time. And there will be 4 presenters, not just me.
Great. Yeah, I feel like we could dig in deep with almost everything that you've talked about here today. So much more. There's so much to work with here.
It's always fun to try to get 5 years of progress into a 20-minute talk.
Yeah, we really, put you to the test this month for this talk. And then I'll like to just give another brief announcement just for our next webinar, which will be on February 20th, and that'll be on the burden of osteoarthritis. I believe this will be a 2-parter. So this will be great to learn more about OA in our country, international, the cost, the effect of it. So definitely tune in for that. I will post the link here in the chat and we'll send out a reminder email as well. But with that, I think we'll probably end the call today. And I will be sending out all the supplemental files that Matthew talked about today and that I posted in the chat, along with a link to this webinar. So be on the lookout for that. Great. So thank you, Matthew.
Thank you for the opportunity.